Okay, we are live. How is everyone doing today? We have with us Alexander Mercouris in London, and we have a very special guest making, I believe it's your second or third appearance with us, Glenn. We have Mr. Glenn Diesen. Glenn, you are in Norway, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And the third appearance, yeah.
Yes, fantastic. Glenn, where can people find you before we begin this live stream?
Oh, I'm on social media, I guess. Twitter. I'm back on Twitter for past 6 months. Facebook, LinkedIn, and Vkontakte. So,
All right.
and Telegram.
And Telegram. I'll have all those links down below in as a pinned comment. I have a lot of those links already in the description box. You also have a bunch of books as well, Glenn, that people can find on Amazon, I take it?
They should all be on Amazon. I had my last book on Russophobia and propaganda in international politics, which came out about 4 months ago. So that was my 9th book.
Fantastic. 9 books. Wow. All right. So let's get started. A quick hello to everybody that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, on YouTube, on Rumble, Telegram, and the Duran.locals.com. Hello to our amazing Duran Locals community. And hello to our moderators. We have with us the one and only Valies is in the house. Hello, Valies. We have the one and only Spartan Warrior Queen as well. And myself, the one and only me. We are going to be moderating for this live stream. So thank you to our moderators. Thank you, Valies. Thank you, Spartan Warrior Queen. And let's get rolling. Alexander, Glenn, let's talk about the neocons in Europe. It seems like Europe is more neocon than the United States. At least that's the impression that I get. But Europe is very much hungry for more conflict. And as you said, Glenn, Russophobia everywhere in the EU. Alexander, Glenn, take it away.
Well, indeed so. And I have to say, I think before observation that this is, of course, an extraordinary reversal, an extraordinary situation in Europe today. Now, a couple of decades ago, and we're not talking about a very, very long time ago, we had a situation where the United States was about to invade Iraq. And we had 2 major European leaders at that time, Jacques Chirac, who was the president of France, Gerhard Schröder, who was the chancellor of Germany. They both opposed that invasion. And they were able to take, and they were willing to take, a position which was critical of the United States and of US foreign policy and of the neocon drive of US foreign policy. You go back a little bit further, in fact, not very much further. I can remember in Britain, Margaret Thatcher, often seen as a strong Atlanticist, a strong anti-communist, a supporter of NATO, all of these things, but she did not hesitate to criticize the United States when she thought that the United States was wrong about doing various things. So she was very, very critical of the US invasion of Grenada, an island in the Caribbean, which is part of the British Commonwealth and which the United States invaded in 1983. And she was also a very, very strong supporter of the construction of gas pipelines from Russia, the Soviet Union as it then was, to Central Europe, to Germany. And she even supported British companies that participated in the building of those pipelines. And that was Margaret Thatcher. And then you go back further still, and you have leaders like President de Gaulle of France, how he used to talk about the fact that US policy in Vietnam was completely wrong. He would go to Moscow and talk about Russia being part of the European family. He spoke about a Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. He was always very careful, by the way, to talk about Russia. He didn't like calling the country the Soviet Union. But anyway, he very, very much saw Russia as part of a European identity. And of course, we had previous German chancellors, Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, pursuing Ostpolitik policies. We used to have situations with Helmut Kohl, who carried out reunification, and he also sought a very, very close relationship with Russia indeed. And we had a very diverse media in the West and a very diverse civil society. We had powerful peace movements, we had trade unions, we had academic contacts, we had people from the military, I remember, ex-military people who used to travel from Western Europe to Russia to maintain contacts with their Russian counterparts. And none of that exists today. It's all been shut down right across Europe. Just before we started this program, Glenn was talking about an incident that he learned about, which affected an academic colleague in a European university. We're not going to say more about that. We don't want to identify anybody, but it was pretty extraordinary. And my wife, who's also an academic, we also know of cases where people, even academics, and universities have generally been considered places of refuge for independent thinking. Academics have been targeted as well. Academic programs have been targeted. And of course, we've had comprehensive sanctions of a sort that we've never had before. And we have an extraordinary atmosphere in which all European governments and the entire European media seems to be enlisted in one extraordinary crusade in which it all speaks with one voice. How has it happened? When did it happen? What was the point of change? And does this tell us things about the way in which the European Union works and about the way in which the European Union is itself now becoming an enforcer of particular ideas across Europe? The diversity of Europe 50 years ago and the monoconformism of today is astonishing. Any general thoughts about this, Glenn, before we go into these more detailed discussions?
No, I agree with what you've said. I think that, Alex used the word neocon, and I think that's a very good description. This is, neocons are known for this very deep belief in the moral righteousness of using military force, and this is something that we obviously also see now. This is a strange combination of this belief in their own moral authority, even as the rest of the world now see less towards especially Europe for moral authority, and is combined with this very new militaristic language and actions. So this is very strange, because I used to teach, before I moved to Norway, I used to teach EU politics in both Australia and Russia. And on the curriculum, we would always have articles like the EU, civilian power, ethical power, moral power. This was it was a different kind of power, one which has given up on its its past of all these problems. So I'm not sure quite how they ended up in this situation. I think but I would like to say it's just because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It took everyone by such a surprise that everyone jumped full into this, going very aggressive, and thereafter there was no way of walking it back. And but that's not really correct either. I mean, you mentioned also Ostpolitik from. And I think it was last year, definitely not this year, it was before Russia's invasion, last year, when you have the German foreign minister. Then he went out to talk about Ostpolitik, and he was arguing that in Willy Brandt's days, Ostpolitik meant, they had to talk to Moscow in order to engage with other Eastern European countries. But now that they were free from Moscow, now Germany's priority should be only to deal with the Eastern Europeans and show them solidarity in their struggle against Russia. So suddenly, what was meant as a peace project back in the days, having mutual understanding and peace through dialogue, is suddenly now portrayed as simply being it was a temporary necessity. And now that Eastern Europe is free of Moscow, now we have to solidarity with them. The new Ostpolitik is solidarity with them against Moscow. Again, this was last year, so it's kind of a very strange language which has been building up for quite a long time. And again, it's as you correctly mentioned as well. Europe used to focus over the past few years. Now it mentioned it wanted strategic autonomy for the purpose of asserting European sovereignty. Now, well, what happened to this? Europe has been now completely absorbed under U.S. authority. They, cut ourselves off Russia. Now they're saying, Germany especially being pressured to cut themselves economically from China. Again, if you don't have many partners, if you only have the U.S. as a partner, and this is an asymmetrical interdependent partnership, the EU will effectively become almost a vassal of the United States. I hear European politicians express concerns about this, but nothing is done. So it's it's a very strange direction for the Europeans.
It is indeed. And again, I'm glad you brought up the last point, because I've just been reading comments by people like Robert Habeck, who's the Vice Chancellor of Germany and the economics minister, and essentially one of the big people in the German government. And he and Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, are now complaining bitterly about how President Biden's countering inflation act by providing subsidies to industry is actually drawing European industry to the United States. And all of this is becoming increasingly attractive to European industry because energy prices in Europe are so incredibly high in Europe as compared with the United States that they're apparently 4 to 5 times higher in Europe than they are in the United States. But they complain about all of this, but as you absolutely rightly say, they don't seem to have any plan, any real idea about what to do. They say, that this is wrong and unacceptable, and they seem to imply that it's the Americans who need to change their policies to accommodate European concerns. The Americans aren't going to change their policies. Why should they change their policies? Why would they be more concerned about what somebody like Habeck says than the fact that, say, Volkswagen or a big chemical company in Germany is going to relocate to the United States? It seems a very naive way of thinking to me, if naive it is.
No, I agree. And it's not just the Germans. You had a French economic minister going on, I think it was 2 weeks ago, arguing that the United States are deindustrializing Europe. That was his words. And obviously, he wasn't talking about a secret, plot. But as you suggested, this is merely in America's interest. They have this Inflation Reduction Act. They're going to pump in all of this, also new these funds into subsidizing its industries. And a lot of European industries they can't compete. So, and also the ones who want to survive, a lot of them are relocating to the United States. So as a European, I'm tempted to blame the United States, but this is the Europeans, though. We dug this grave for ourselves because I think there was an assumption that the Americans would show solidarity. But what is solidarity in the international political economy? I think for the United States, solidarity means asymmetrical interdependence. That means Europe should be more dependent on the United States. Keep in mind that over the past decade or so, the key challenge for the United States was there was not enough bloc discipline within the collective West, that the Europeans, they traded with whomever they wanted. They aspired for strategic autonomy. They wanted to have their own foreign policy. They talked about all these things. So they didn't want to display any geoeconomic loyalty to the Americans. In other words, they would shop for Chinese technologies or Russian energy, despite the Americans saying don't do this. So what does solidarity mean? Well, this is solidarity in times of conflict. The US is able to convert its security dependency on the United States into economic loyalty, and that's what we're seeing now. So cut yourself off the Russians, cut yourself off China, and now, of course, that Europe is completely dependent on the United States. Now this asymmetrical economic interdependence can be converted into political loyalty. And so this is solidarity. This is bloc discipline. But solidarity suggests US leadership. The Europeans have aspired for something else. They wanted to have a common partnership, so have this collective bargaining power to have equality with the United States. Well, this is all over now. So it's, but again, I would like to blame the United States, but they're acting in their own interest. This is the Europeans, I think, who have gone down this path.
I completely agree with this, and one wonders how it has happened. How have we evolved into the point in Europe where we have this extraordinary willingness to go along with policies that are ultimately completely destructive of Europe's historic autonomy? Because, as I said, during the Cold War, we had a lot of autonomy in Europe. I mean, I can remember, as I said, Margaret Thatcher putting on a fur hat and going to Moscow. I can remember, other European leaders doing the same thing. You can look all the way back to times when, the Europeans pursued their own foreign policies. These were old countries, former great powers, to some extent still powerful countries. And they seem to have just let it go. Now, is this connected with the rise of the EU? Because this seems to me to be the big fundamental change that sometime in the 1990s, late 1980s, early 1990s, we seem to move away from a situation where there were sovereign states in Europe making their own foreign policies, talking to each other, working with each other, part of the same bloc, part of the same trading bloc, but ultimately it was the governments of the countries that made the decisions. Whereas now, the EU and its central institutions, the European Commission, the European Parliament, now seem to be far more important.
Definitely, I think this could be one of the main reasons, because it's always this demand for solidarity, and which effectively means conformity, and it tends to be the surrender of national interests. And again, I'm not sure how this would serve the EU's interest, though. Again, I think that this would be something that could unravel the European Union, because the success of the EU has been to deliver, to strengthen the states, to strengthen its member states. So if you see that international institutions like the EU, it can be conceptualized as a sovereignty maximizing entity. That is, on one hand, countries that enter the EU, they have to give up some sovereignty to join the EU, or to be part of the EU. On the other hand, the idea is that their membership in the EU gives them this collective bargaining power, which helps to strengthen the states. So, because no state can really stay that strong on its own. But on this cost-benefit analysis, you're supposed to come out strong at the end. But I think this push towards having an ever stronger, they call it more Europe, continue to transfer these competencies to the EU. It's supposed to make the EU and Europe stronger, but instead, I think it has allowed the EU bureaucracy to take on a life of its own, and the nation states kind of are expected to show their solidarity and conformity, and so I think this will probably become a huge problem for the EU in the future. So far, you only see Hungary speaking really up against, especially in the current war, but as this economic crisis will begin to wear heavy on around the necks of the European economies, I think more and more countries will start to distance themselves from the EU. So, no, it's a great question. I don't know why they would delegate so much power to it. So.
I mean, is there perhaps a kind of EU neoconservatism alongside the neoconservatism in the United States? Because if we look at neoconservatism, I mean, my own one's conception of neoconservatism is that it's essentially an American thing. It's all about promoting the hegemonic, unipolar position of the United States and using all of America's power to basically beat down challengers and justifying all of this and rationalizing it as saying that, the United States stands for, liberal civilization. So it's got almost a duty to behave in this way. Do we have something parallel to this in Europe, which is connected with the EU itself? That the EU itself has now developed a kind of neocon ideology that flows in parallel with that of the United States as well, which also says you have to have a single set of beliefs in Europe. You've got to abide by the rules of the EU system, and this is somehow the ethical perfect system. And it means that if we get into a conflict, everybody must conform with this conflict. I mean, and I say this because the other thing that's happening is that one thing that I don't think many people are talking about is that as a result of this crisis, this particular crisis, the EU has enormously extended its power. The EU institutions now have a huge role, for example, in energy policy, in financial policy, in all kinds of things, which even 5 years ago, they were not able to have.
Well, you have to look at the legitimacy of the EU. I mean, this is almost like a state-building project if you want a federalized European Union. And initially, the European Union had its main source of legitimacy or attraction was as an economic power. So they were able to, they were seen as being this economic locomotive driving forward. Everyone wanted to join it. But I think in difficult economic times, especially since the global financial crisis, it rested more and more on ideology instead. So again, the EU has to be recognized as very, very much an ideological project, and it's not that different from the United States. Keep in mind that the United States it wanted to develop a new world order after the Cold War. So instead of developing this inclusive Europe, common European home, if you will, they went with American hegemony. Very open in its security strategy. Security was based on the principle that no country should ever even have the possibility of aspiring towards superseding its military power. So American hegemony was quite central, but of course you need legitimacy for this, and liberal democracy was a key source of this legitimacy. It was this Fukuyama's dream, if you will, this end of history. The idea was the U.S. was the dominant power. Any country wanted to prosper would have to convert its political and economic system according to the U.S. and kind of accept U.S. leadership, and this was expected to be their role. Now, the European Union had a very, very, very similar ideology. They also had this, liberal democratic hegemonic thesis, but their objective was to use their collective bargaining power, all the EU members, to establish a sort of a co-partnership, if you will, with the United States, where the West effectively was consisting of two pillars, one the US and one of the EU, and so I think that ideology has played a growing role, and this also would explain some of the lack of pragmatism with Russia, because one doesn't have to agree with Russia's military actions. One can't really. I find it very strange, this denying Russia any security. Any insecurity or responding to security concerns in any reasonable way. So I think there's a lot of ideology at the heart of it, and so the EU and the US aren't that different, really, especially in these days.
I mean, I have to say, there's also incredible amount of cynicism, which is, by the way, in my experience, very often the case with very ideological people. They can be extremely cynical at much the same time. So we have German foreign ministers, as you said, saying, well, we used to have to talk to the Russians because it was important during the Cold War because we couldn't talk to the East Europeans. Now we don't need to talk to the Russians anymore because we just need to go with the East Europeans, which makes the whole Ostpolitik business seem so cynical in retrospect. And by the way, the Russians have picked up on that comment. I know Lavrov has referred to it, for example. And one would have thought that a German foreign minister would know better than almost any other foreign minister in Europe the key importance for maintaining peace of a good relationship between Germany and Russia. And it's both ideological and it's cynical. And it is also completely unrealistic at the same time, also, it seems to me. So denying Russia has security concerns is, in a way of undermining our own security. Because if Russia doesn't feel secure, neither can we.
No, and I agree, and I think this is where people don't want to talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union as a negative thing because, well, there seems to be a consensus it was all good. And again, I'm not here to defend the values of the Soviet Union, but an interesting character would be one of the people who helped to negotiate the end of the Cold War, which is Jack Matlock. He was the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. And his main argument, which is interesting to explore, is that the United States and Moscow, they were negotiating end to the Cold War, and in 1989 the Cold War was declared over. So it was a compromise, and we should develop a common Europe. This was the basic idea that came from it. And but instead, 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed, and he argued, in the euphoria, we neglected what was negative with this, which was, he argued that immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed, the US began with myth-making. They said, no, the Cold War wasn't negotiated to an end, it was won. And, many people have probably seen the State of the Union speech by Bush 1 month after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where he gets up behind the podium and says, the Cold War didn't simply end, it was won. The leader of the West is now the leader of the world. And Matlock's main argument was that this created a very dangerous political culture in the United States, because now, if you have conflict with adversaries, it's not solved by sitting down and making compromises and negotiating a common peace. Instead, what you do is you stare them down, you arm yourself to the teeth, you have the Western showdown, and then whoever blinks first loses. And this is how America preserves peace, by defeating all its adversaries. So he argued that this is very dangerous, because they did not just lost the peace, but they also created a horrible idea about what actually creates peace. And just last, it ruined Europe, because we now say, we don't understand that, like you pointed out, that if we don't give Russia peace, then they will respond in a manner which undermines our peace. Well, we recognize this. In 1990, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, since the Cold War was over, we actually signed agreements with the Russians to develop a new Europe. They were called Charter of Paris for a New Europe. This was in 1990. And some of the key texts focused on sovereign equality, so equal sovereignty for all sides. And there should be indivisible security. In other words, one side should not expand its security at the expense of the other. And lastly, most importantly, there should be no dividing lines in Europe. Well, these were the key principles. We even developed the OSCE as a common institution in '94 based on these principles. But then Russia was weak. We expanded NATO instead, and all of these principles have been undermined. So it's just extraordinary, but especially the Germans, that they're not doing anything to defend this. It's very strange.
Absolutely, given that they're the major beneficiaries of the changes that took place in 1989. I mean, in effect, they're turning their backs on the very policy that brought them to the success that they eventually achieved. And you mentioned the OSCE. Well, there's supposed to be an OSCE meeting in Poland, and the Russians are excluded. I mean, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is going to apparently have a general meeting, and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is not allowed to attend, and apparently no one else from Russia is allowed to attend, which calls into question what the OSCE has become now. It's become a complete, as far as I can see, just another part of the furniture of the Western system. But I mean, it is extraordinary that all this has happened. And as I say, it's all happened in parallel with firstly the United States behaving as you said, but also with the EU centralizing all the time. And this is another thing I wanted to just bring up, because whenever anybody speaks out against these policies, and you have had various European leaders who've attempted to, Orban is the example, they always get criticized for breaking solidarity, that they're not loyal to the EU itself, and they're basically intimidated, often into agreeing to policies which one senses they don't actually agree with. And again, the EU, as a result, that gives enormous power, or so it seems to be, both to its central institutions, which help to formulate those policies, and to the various hardline outriders, the Baltic states and whatever, which seem to me to wield an influence far beyond their actual weight.
Yeah, but this is also the transformation of the European Union, because again, in the 90s and early 2000s, this was the golden era of the EU. It was assumed that next century would belong to the Europeans, and it was said that the EU had a gravitational pull. All countries kind of wanted to join, and the more they wanted to join, the more successful it was, and it was able, because everyone wanted to join, they had to adopt the European legal framework, which effectively allowed them to dictate economic rules, strengthening them even more. So there was this idea that it became a legislative empire and a huge economic bloc. But then, of course, you had the economic downturn, and especially after the global financial crisis, there was a lot of American economists and scholars as well who pointed out that the EU had changed fundamentally. It became, when it couldn't attract anymore, it became more and more dependent on punishing, so using the whip instead of the carrot. And so there's many examples, not just in Greece after the global financial crisis. We see it also with Britain, with Brexit, that the EU essentially want to cut off its nose to spite the face. They just really go after, punish countries who don't do as they're told. And now, of course, we have more in the area of security, in which countries, like especially then Hungary, is being challenged for not having enough solidarity, which means effectively submission. Because and again, I was in Hungary only like a month or two ago for this Eurasian forum of the central bank there, and they were just the rhetoric there is quite different. They were kind of appalled that they didn't join a political union, a state, if you will, that was allowed to dictate the politics of Hungary. They joined an economic club, which was the most use collective bargaining power to strengthen the economies of all member states. But now that they were in, they effectively had the EU overriding their political system, which they never subscribed to. So it's a very different view.
It's a very strange thing, because again, you talk about, you mentioned, Glenn, before, about how in the United States this whole system was this whole neocon system was justified as being to promote liberal democracy. And the same is happening in the EU. The EU conflates itself to an extraordinary degree with liberal democracy. And yet what you are describing are mechanisms which are becoming increasingly authoritarian and coercive, which is not how liberal democracy, as I used to understand it, was supposed to work.
Well, there's an interesting article written, was in 1950 by an American scholar named John Hertz. He called it, he referred to idealist internationalism. He was pointing out that, you have different examples. For example, after the French Revolution, this was an idealist internationalism. It begins with an ideal of human freedom. In that instance, sovereignty belongs to the people, not the monarchy. And it was expected right away that once they had this freedom domestically, they wouldn't even have to do, it would be a peace project, because they didn't have to engage in foreign policy. It would just spread automatically. Everyone would embrace this freedom and align under the French. But then this didn't happen. So then, the French declared their intention to pursue the freedom of all other peoples. And then this didn't work. So they go to war, and after a while they forgot that instead of having an internationalist idea, they simply just become an empire effectively. And he argued that at that time the Bolsheviks kind of did the same. They were, they also just they weren't even going to have a foreign policy. Just they had this ideal about human freedom. The world would naturally have its own revolution towards this. It didn't happen. Then they went out to help the freedom of other peoples, and at the end they just became another entity of power. And what else can you say about the EU as well as the US after the Cold War? I mean, it began with this liberal ideal that all countries would just transform into liberal democracies, just like the West. And when it failed to happen, we would bring freedom to others in the form of this humanitarian interventionism. But at the end of the day, it just turned out to be traditional power politics. With the liberalism being simply a thin veil of unilateralism and often imperialism. So I think the ideology has a lot to say about how they have acted, though.
Indeed, I mean, imperialism, and I mean, you have extraordinary comments like those of Josep Borrell, that we're the garden, everyone else is the jungle, and we must go out, like gardeners and prune the jungle and bring it to sort of order in some extraordinary way. I mean, an extraordinary reversion from a supposed liberal Democrat, which is what he presumably claims himself to be. It's an extraordinary reversion to sort of neo-colonialist imperialist thinking.
Yeah, but that's what you need. That's what often ideology does. It has a hierarchical ordering. So what is said is that the jungle will penetrate the garden. In other words, they will influence us or change us unless we first go and change them. So it's not two equals. It's one civilized side and one uncivilized. And this is why again, if you want some of the imperial legacy of this liberal internationalism. Because this isn't new. I mean, we had the principle of sovereignty in the past, but for example, after the Peace of Westphalia, but it was supposed to be for civilized states. So, white people, that was the general idea. So sovereignty was limited, and now we have the same. We have, under liberal democracy, sovereignty. We still don't have sovereign equality. It's supposed to be sovereignty for the West, but not the rest. And this has been. Again, this is the gardening, a criticism of the gardening analogy of Josep Borrell. This idea that one side should have this authority, and again, it's very explicit. I mean, this is one of the main problem with Russia, that we cancelled this basic agreement we had about sovereign equality, because when we interfere in Russia's domestic affairs, it's legitimate because it's democracy. But if they do it with us, it's almost a declaration of war. We can intervene in other countries, invade other countries because it's humanitarian interventions. They cannot. We can topple government. We call it democratic revolutions. They are not allowed to topple countries. So you have this system of sovereign equality: one rule for us, one for them, also known as the rules-based international order. And this is Borrell's garden, and this is why. There's very little sympathy for it outside the borders of the NATO countries.
And of course, the other result of all of this, though, is that what's actually happening is that because we are behaving in this fashion, because we are becoming more authoritarian and coercive in Europe towards others, it's inevitably making us more authoritarian and coercive towards ourselves. So those of us who make these points and point to these inconsistencies, we're finding the climate for ourselves becoming increasingly difficult. And we're becoming more restricted in where we can express these views. We've already discussed how the academia is becoming more less open than it used to be. And of course, the media, it's become very difficult. And if you are a political leader in any European state and you challenge this orthodoxy now, well, you have the wolves set on you. I mean, I've seen it done in Britain to two political leaders, very different from each other, completely contrasting. Farage in one respect, and of course, Corbyn on the other. But I mean, I think that happens all over Europe now. And liberal democracy is being promoted abroad but destroyed at home.
Yeah, well, this was also one of the warnings of Zbigniew Brzezinski in '97. He argued that, he argued for a global hegemony of the United States, but he did warn if you're going to have an empire abroad, it's going to be very difficult to preserve your democracy at home. And but again, it's very difficult these days to have any opposition because they have to protect democracy away from the rule of the majority these days. They have to make so any criticism, even of NATO, becomes considered now a threat to democracy. So it's and you mentioned just very briefly on the academic aspect. I mean, since February of this year, when Russia invaded Ukraine, there must be at least a dozen different Norwegian newspapers and channels who have done these hit pieces. And it was the most extraordinary thing because I said from the first day that I was opposed to the war, like much like I was opposed to all the other wars that NATO had begun, and yet the last article they had was a newspaper that was able to, because they weren't able to pressure the university to have me fired. So one newspaper wrote 7 pages article about me, and the main argument that it was not an issue about whether or not up to the university, it was an issue of me being in breach of international law. They said, because I have spoken with Russian media, it doesn't matter if I'm against the war, because I've spoken with Russian media does propaganda, and war propaganda is against international law. Now I'm in breach of international law, and there's no place for me in Norwegian universities. This is, follow that logic. It's obscene, but this is where we are. It's as we began talk, I have a colleague in Denmark. He lost his job last week because of this. He's always, he's teaching Ukraine, Russian politics. They fired him because he had an opinion. He had written about, Crimea, and they feared that it might be seen as, written years ago, that this might legitimize Russian actions. So gone. So this is our values. It didn't last very long.
No, it hasn't lasted long. It's incredible how little defended it is. I have to say, the idea that an academic like yourself could be in breach of international law, I find that so bizarre. I mean, that is so. I mean, any lawyer who has worked in international law will just know how utterly crazy that whole conception is. And yet, presumably, this is in a reputable newspaper, magazine, or something like this. I mean, I can't say, but you get very, very weird things all over the place now, across the Western media as well. And whenever anybody does want to write, say, in a British newspaper to suggest we change our policy, they have to resort to this extremely complicated language now to try to get their message across. They have to qualify pretty much everything they say and use various circumlocutions and things of this kind. So it doesn't come across very clearly or very strongly.
No, and that's what bothers me these days. There's a lot of dishonesty, and I was trying to figure out which dishonesty or which aspect of the censorship is most dangerous. And I think I nailed it down to the issue of NATO expansion, because here's my point. If you consider they argue now that Russia does not really believe that NATO expansion is a threat, and this is quite important because the argument is that Russia, if Russia isn't reacting to NATO expansion, then why did it invade? Well, then the argument is they just woke up one day, craving some territory, or Putin's just a bad man. They want to restore the Soviet Union, and if this is the case, then Russia's opportunistic and expansionist. Then of course the main solution should be we then have a moral obligation to pump as much weapons into Ukraine as possible, because to deter this. So Russia will do a cost-benefit analysis and then, walk away from this opportunism. However, if Russia's merely reacting to NATO expansion, if we're then pumping more weapons in and threatening more for NATO to get involved and, for NATO to expand, then, and Russia actually do consider this to be an existential threat, well, then we're just escalating the crisis, and we're creating a proxy war which Russia can't walk away from. So this is why I think this question about NATO expansion is so central. This should be the key thing we debate, but it is completely eliminated from the discourse, because if you suggest it, you're a Putin propagandist. And I find this to be so extraordinary because, many of the greatest Americans, politicians, be George Kennan. He said NATO was a threat to Russia. Expansion. You had, in the 90s, you had 50 American politicians, diplomats signing a letter. This is a threat to Russia. Jack Matlock, the ambassador to the Soviet Union. Robert Gates, he was a CIA director. He said that this trying to expand to Ukraine was really going too far. You had William Perry, also defense secretary to the Bill Clinton administration, saying, no, this would threaten Russia. But he complained that all of his colleagues essentially said, well, so what? They're weak. What the hell can they do? And then, William Burns, he was the ambassador to Moscow and then the CIA director. Also, he warned that Russia saw this as an existential threat and they would intervene in Ukraine if this went forward. He warned this in 2008. And recently, you had Angela Merkel going out in the papers in an interview asking, why didn't you offer permanent time for Ukraine to join NATO in 2008? And she said, well, this will be seen as a declaration of war by Moscow because they see this as a threat. Even the Pope, for God's sake, said that this was a threat to Russia. So, so if all these leading, CIA agents, directors, ambassadors, defense secretaries, foreign ministers, all them for more than 20 years arguing, yes, Russia considers this to be a genuine threat. But if you want to cite any of them or repeat them today, you're dismissed as a Russian propagandist. It's insane. But otherwise, this whole narrative of Russia being simply an expansionist, opportunistic power, it collapses. So it's very important to keep this lie alive. But as you pointed out correctly, this requires to reinvent the language and punish, censor any the deviants.
Absolutely. I mean, within the Labour Party in Britain, for example, there was a group of Labour MPs who at the beginning of the war tried to make precisely those comments. And basically, they were threatened with expulsion from the party if they did. And so they all conformed. And you will not get anybody in Britain today in the political class who argues, who makes the point about NATO expansion that you have done. And I can remember a time in the Cold War when it was considered perfectly respectable within the British Labour Party to be opposed to NATO. We've gone from this extreme position where you could argue during the Cold War that NATO should be abolished entirely to the position today where even if you talk about NATO expansion as a bad thing, that is prohibited. It's taboo. You can't talk about it. You can't survive in politics if you say it. Well, Glenn, we've talked about many things, and we've been talking for almost 15 minutes. I was going to now turn over to my colleague, Alex Christoforou. He's perhaps got some questions to put to you, and maybe he's got some questions that he wants to bring up from the discussion.
Yeah, we've got a lot of good questions. You guys want to begin? Want to answer some questions? All right. But by the way, Glenn Alexander, I think the EU is a cult. So.
Well, it's become that. Yeah. I mean, I can remember when it wasn't, of course, called the EU. When it wasn't,
the high elite are cult.
Yeah, I know. I can remember once upon a time when it was what it used to be, an economic grouping of states that worked together to rebuild Europe, basically after the Second World War. I mean, I can remember, and I, liked it, as many people did. But today's EU, I don't recognize as that institution that I remember from so long ago in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, I agree with you. It sounds like everything you guys were saying that they simply just don't want to have anything to do with Russia. Period. End of story. So Russia should just, cut them off completely. I understand the reasons why Russia is always open to diplomacy, and they say, let's keep the door open, all these things. But the current leadership in the European Union, it's obvious. The collective West in general, they don't want anything to do with Russia at all.
Well, just to quickly say to that, I can remember a former British Defence Secretary coming out and saying that he just wished that Russia would shut up and go away. Now, there were some people who thought that went a bit too far when he said it. I don't know that it would be challenged today. I don't know what you think about that, Glenn.
Well, I think you should. Well, one has to be careful what one wishes for, because for example, the Germans, Europeans, they often treat it as if they did Russia a favor by trading with Russia. But as we see now, the economic cooperation with Russia has been quite important for Europe. Just look at Germany. All this cheap Russian energy and natural resources, metals, all this coming into Europe has been imperative for the competitiveness of European industries, and also this huge huge Russian market, which not only buys everything the Europeans are selling, but every time the Russians had any big strategic, economic project in the Arctic or anything, it was always earmarked for the Europeans. This. Like now, for example, with all the Russian resources going to the east and all those markets going to the east, I think the Europeans, it's not going to be a minor correction. I don't think you can go back to the way things were anymore. No. This was a huge component of the European economy. And on a final note, one has to be careful what they wish for, because when we canceled this common pan-European security agreements with the Russians, they still attempted, if you remember, to be a part of, find a different format to integrate with Europe. You had Medvedev having this back in 2008. He had this proposal for a new European security architecture. You had Putin's proposal in 2010 for an EU-Russian common market, from Lisbon. Vladivostok, and we kind of shut all of those down. Well, what happened in 2014 when we helped to topple the government in Ukraine? They kind of saw this as, well, now there's no more hope anymore to integrate with the West. We have to go east, and that's effectively when they dropped this Greater Europe initiative, which was this based on Gorbachev's common European home, and they instead went with Greater Eurasia. And this is what they've been working towards now. They want to have their own. They don't want to be dependent anymore on Western technologies, the industries, the transportation corridors, the banks, their currency, the payment systems. Across the board, they want to decouple and diversify, and so they're looking towards the east. And again, it's working. Otherwise, Russia would not have been able to sustain these sanctions. So Russia is going away. They are now seeking a Eurasian future. This is not a good thing, I think, for Europe. So I'm arguing from a European interested perspective, and I think this policy has very much failed what we've been doing with the Russians.
I completely agree.
Questions?
Yeah. Is there going to be conflict in the Balkans, in Serbia, with the license plate Kosovo-Metohija issue? Do you guys want to sound off on that real quick? They've given a 2-day extension on the license plate issue.
I don't know whether there's going to be a conflict over this particular issue, though I think it is more likely than it has been. But we are building towards that point when a conflict is going to come. It may not be this time, but sooner or later it's going to happen. I'm absolutely sure of it.
I agree. This is a remnant from recognizing Kosovo's independence. So I think the reason why we haven't had the conflict yet was because the U.S. effectively told the Kosovo Albanians to delay it, which then helps to now they delayed for 48 hours if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So it's they want to avoid this. I think this is simply in America's interest as well to delay this conflict, because at the moment there's too many unknown variables. Too many conflicts, especially the war in Ukraine. So I agree. I think it's a conflict that will come, but it will probably be pushed down the road later.
Right. Okay. From not a banned account, how much would a Trump return embolden Putin?
By embolden,
Well, Trump is a Putin puppet, of course.
Oh yeah, okay. Now I got it.
Would it embolden
My own view about. Can I just
Putin? Sorry, would it
say
embolden?
my own thoughts about this, which is that from a Russian point of view, the Trump administration was a disaster. I mean, Donald Trump may have sincerely wanted to improve relations with Russia, but he failed. And the campaign against Trump in America resulted in this enormous propaganda campaign, which dragged Russia in and has played a major role, in my opinion, in consolidating and hardening anti-Russian feeling, not just in the United States, but in the West generally. So I don't think that the Russians are looking forward to the return of Donald Trump. Perhaps they're wrong. Perhaps a new Trump presidency might take a different line, might be more successful than the previous Trump presidency was. But I think the Russians will look back to what happened over the 4 years that Trump was president, and they'll say, well, this didn't bring us any good then, and another re-elected Donald Trump isn't going to bring us any good in the future, regardless of what the man himself might want.
Yeah, I think they were initially very optimistic about Trump, though, because him as well as Bannon, they had pointed out that a lot of mistakes were done with Russia in the 90s, and Russia's security concerns, basic security concerns, could be met in order for America to divert its focus somewhere else. I think that the problem was, though, after a very long Cold War, you have this bipartisan consensus for this anti-Russian stance, and you kind of need for political legitimacy to take a hawkish stance on Russia. Now, I think that this is what you need for anyone who really wants to improve relations with Russia. I mean, look at Ronald Reagan. He was, very hawkish on Moscow, on the Soviet Union, but it was because he was, so aggressive that no one would accuse him of being soft on the Russians. So that gave him some political space, I think, to maneuver and, seek a peace with the Russians. And the contrast, Trump, he went straight off the bat. He said, no, well, Russia has done bad things, so have we. We can, getting along with Russia is a good thing. Why do we need to expand the NATO? He essentially said everything that Moscow wanted to hear. So right away, he became, as the documents released now show, Hillary Clinton immediately identified this would be, the weak part in its armor. We can portray him as a Russian agent. And so, in order to prove himself otherwise, his policies were a disaster. I mean, pulled out of arms control agreements, arming Ukraine, just a very aggressive behavior. So I don't think necessarily. Of course, I could be wrong. I've heard some of the people close to Trump said that his main mistake was he surrounded himself with a staff which kind of undermined him from day one. Maybe he learned from his mistake. If he would get a second shot, maybe he would, clean up the house first, and then, because this was a problem during his presidency.
All right. From Herding Cats, how can this be anything other than a controlled demolition of current reality by the West in order to institute a new terrifying system?
Well, I mean, the problem is, this is what I always say about these things, these theories. I mean, they may be true about some people, but there is no such thing as a controlled demolition. If you try and engage in a controlled demolition, what you will find is that there are weaknesses in the system that perhaps you can't anticipate. And the whole thing will the risk you run is that the whole thing will tumble down and will take you down with it. So it might be some people's idea that, this is the kind of thing we want to do. But people who think like that are both extremely dangerous and very wrong, one way or the other. We who do not want to see any kind of demolition at all, our obligation, our duty, it seems to me, is to put the counter arguments and to point out how dangerous the demolition is, whether it is intended or not, and point out that, you know, people who are doing the kind of things that they're doing are taking extraordinary risks.
Well said. A follow-up to that question from Big Brother. The EU structure is clearly going to collapse. The train has left the station now. In your judgment, will it be a slow death or consumed first in chaos?
I expect it to go a lot faster. There's an argument I like. It was by the Greek, I think, finance minister back in the 2000s. I forgot his name. Anyway, so he was making he was making the argument that by not making the necessary reforms, and the EU would he could hold on to his position, and moving from his argument, it would the EU can use threats and try to continue without any reforms. But the only thing, by delaying it, would ensure that it would unravel much faster once the problems actually hit. And I think this is where it is at every turn. I think economically it's been thinned out so much now. It's if things begin to unravel, it could collapse quickly. The political legitimacy, I think, in terms of taking more sovereignty than they're able to deliver, I think just across the board, my best bet would be on a quick unraveling if it begins. But again, I don't have a crystal ball, so.
From Michael Tombros, America seems to be able to blow up Europe's critical gas pipelines, and the European governments don't seem to mind. Why is that? Good question. Why is that? They blew up a pipeline. They blew up a pipeline.
Well, and let's point out that this isn't the first time. I mean, as I said, the Americans did the same thing, and this is not even disputed history. It is accepted history. Some of the people who were involved have talked about this. They did this in 1982 when they inserted software into a Soviet gas pipeline, and it created a massive explosion in Western Siberia. And it could be seen from space, apparently. It was such a huge explosion. Now, we've discussed the Nord Stream attacks, and we've discussed this extensively. And obviously, we've not had an official report. I've made my own beliefs absolutely clear that the Russians were not involved, because I cannot see from what conceivable benefit or cost benefit they would have to carrying out an attack like this. And I made it also very clear that if the Russians weren't involved, the United States, in my opinion, must have been involved at least at some level. But the fact is that if you look at the situation that Europe is now in, at the commitment they've made to the United States, this commitment they've made to fighting Russia, they can't break with the US over Nord Stream 2. They can't break over anything. I mean, we've had Robert Habeck, I was talking about this before, and the French finance minister, I think it was Glenn was saying, complaining about how the United States is hoovering up European industry. But that doesn't change, that doesn't cause them to break with the United States, because ideologically and politically, they can't. If they tried to now, the political leaders who we've been talking about would be going firstly against their own ideological positions. But secondly, I mean, they would be collectively discredited if it turned out that, they started to criticize the United States in that kind of way.
Well, I agree. It's a huge ideological reasons to maintain the solidarity. But obviously in these times, I don't think they could have done this last year to blow up the pipelines, because so you have to see the security aspect of it. I mean, this isn't human nature. If we feel an external threat, we feel more compelled to having greater solidarity with the in-group. Now, this also applies for states, of course. If you see an external threat, there will be more cohesion, solidarity among the main members of an alliance. But so obviously, I think this is a reason why we wouldn't want to criticize or accuse the United States. Again, I would also put myself on putting the United States as the main suspects, or at least they would have known about this. But again, let's say we don't have any evidence for that. But what we do have evidence for is how the Western media has covered this, because they say there's no way that the United States have any interest in this. This is conspiracy theory. But really, no interest. This we can check. Here we have evidence, because the United States, not just Biden, but many of the leading politicians have over the years now said that they don't want to see Nord Stream 2 go through. They say this is a huge, this undermines the United States. They should buy from US instead. They have even threatened that they would, Biden, he threatened it physically that, if Russia would go into Ukraine, there would be no Nord Stream 2. And, this, he said, would be America's decision, not Germany's. And even after Nord Stream was blown up, you had, was it Sullivan, who went out in the media, said, "Oh, this is a wonderful opportunity." Yet there was no benefits for America, we're told. And it's just it's very dishonest. It's a bunch of nonsense, effectively. And the fact that the Americans put sanctions on the Europeans for building these pipelines, and then saying that the Americans had no interest to stop it, it just, this you can prove factually is incorrect. So it kind of shows that Europeans will, go to great length not to criticize the United States. And again, I would point to the security aspect of this war as the main reason.
Well, both of you mentioned the United States, but the UK is directly implicated, or allegedly. Allegedly, the UK has a major hand in this, given the text messages done, all these things, which we don't have confirmation for. I mean,
yes,
that has been 100% confirmed. But the one country that has been put out in front with regards to the Nord Stream hasn't so much been the United States; it's been the UK.
Well, if that follows through, first of all, I have to say
if
straight
it follows
away,
through, I mean, we have to state.
I mean, can I just say a few things about this? First of all, it is inconceivable that Britain would have done this thing without a green light from the United States, even if it was the British who did this. I mean, I can say that categorically. And if you take that text message from Truss as real, which I do, by the way, I do believe it is real. I've seen no convincing denial that it exists and that it is not real. But if you take it as real, the very fact that she was sending messages like that to Washington in effect confirms a degree of, shall we say, collusion or mutual understanding or cooperation over this enterprise between the British and the Americans. So I think that if you go after the British, it inevitably is going to lead you to the Americans. And for that reason, perhaps conceivably, if you really want to distance America from this, you could set up the British as the fall guy. But I have to say, in all honesty, I don't think anybody, either the British or the Americans, are ever going to be criticized with this thing by at least the present group of leaders that we have in Europe.
All right. Peter Surgeris says, "Gents, no doubt you remember well how deflating the Tsipras capitulation, rejection of the overwhelming Ohi, no vote, was in 2015. Is there any alternative than Europeans getting out again on the streets? My relatives in Athens seem numb to everything these days. Is there any alternative outside of protesting to save EU member states?"
Well, protesting is a part of politics. I think that's the first thing to say. So, I mean, and if people do come out into the streets and they do protest, and there's been a long article in the Financial Times about protests beginning to take off in a big way, for example, in Eastern Germany, then of course that does over time have an effect, and it can have an effect on political parties and in political movements. But of course, the system, the political system that we've been talking about, that, Glenn and we've been talking about, the problems that liberal democracy, so-called, is now running into at the moment in Europe. I mean, whatever it is, it's not the liberal democracy that we all remember. That does make a political challenge very difficult. My own personal view is that it will be the economic structural problems that in the end become overwhelming. That Europe can't run without gas, it can't run without oil, its financial systems are in chaos, its industrial systems are in chaos. If they all start to break down, that is what will then open the political space, if you like, for protest, for political action to take place, which will accelerate the move of the system downward.
Okay. Let's see here. From Dominique, great. Thanks for your outstanding analysis. I follow every day in Porque la Grèce. Jeu de Romilly highlights the tendency of the Greek spirit to seek the universal, I see, as if by chance, both of you Greeks, you follow the same approach. Thucydides would be proud of you. Thank you.
Well,
Thank you
what can
for
one
that.
say? Thank you.
Okay, what could one say there? And from CC, given the grave difficulties the U.S. faces at the moment, I can't see why it wouldn't act in its own self-interest and prioritize itself over the EU. These EU leaders are grown adults, are they not? I agree. At the end of the day, isn't Glenn Alexander, isn't the EU to blame for its own collapse, even if the US did everything in their power to push them towards it? At the end of the day, the EU has decided to do this.
No, I agree. That's why when we began to speak, I pointed out that I don't blame really the United States. They've acted in their own interest. It's I think they made the Europeans dig their own grave. I think this is also predictable because I think that the United States effectively has been weakening Russia by fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian and to the last euro. I mean, it's the American economy has done not bad at all, and this is they have their own problem, but this is something you've seen on the other side of the planet as well. With the Australians, they jumped full in on being an American frontline there against China. The Australians lost a huge market share. America picked it up, and you see similar problems now in Europe. Of course, it's not just cutting off from energy resources from Russia, cutting off from the market, but it's also in economics. The most important thing, like economics 101, is you need predictability and trust. Where is this now? I mean, we wouldn't have to focus on Russia, the rest of the world, because often in Europe we tend to feel very virtuous when we do all these sanctions, but we have to keep in mind that 85% of the planet live in countries which have not put sanctions on Russia, and most of them, at least who I have spoken with, have they seem horrified. Like, well, what are you people doing on the continent? You're seizing Russia's assets, and now we're going to make a law making it legal to actually not just freeze them, but to steal the assets. It's just who's going to trust the euro ever again? Who's going to put their money here? It's just I think I think Europe has done a lot of self-harm, and I think in this hubris and this ideological sphere where we believe that we're fighting always on the good side, that we neglected that most of the economy now is very quickly moving away from Europe into the rest of the world, in multipolar systems merging, and we are undermining our own position. So we're not even an independent pole of power anymore. We're distrusted, becoming too dependent on the Americans, and we essentially sanctioned our own industries to death now. So I think it would be too cheap, I think, to blame others, including the United States. So I blame the Europeans, to be honest.
Absolutely. Sajeva says, what do you think about the AP reporter who jumped the gun and reported about a Russian missile got fired? Somebody in the West wants to diffuse the tension, it appears.
It's an interesting story, and it's unusual because usually when journalists write these sort of things and it turns out to be, completely wrong, if it's about Russia, there don't seem to be consequences. I mean, there's a journalist who writes at The Guardian, for example, called Luke Harding. He's a particular fixation of mine, if you like, but he's published so many comments and observations and articles and things. I mean, he was a great believer in Christopher Steele, for example, and his dossier. And he published whole books about this. And he seems to go from strength to strength. He's in Kiev at the moment, by the way, writing for The Guardian. But anyway, so it's unusual for a journalist to be fired in this kind of way. And I do wonder why it has happened this time. I mean, you can take the explanation at face value that it was that he didn't seek corroboration from more than one source. I don't buy that myself. I don't believe that at all. I believe that somebody must be taking this whole affair of the missile very seriously indeed. He must be very, very angry about it, and that there's been a lot of angry criticisms behind the scenes, and this senior intelligence source has probably also been carpeted. And well, clearly it shows what an important event, what an important episode this particular thing was, and steps are being made to make sure it never happens again.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I agree with this, because I think this missile from Ukraine, which hit Poland, really spooked a lot of the West, because this was, could have started World War III, and also the way that Zelensky was eagerly, continuing to hammer down that no, this is Russia, we have to take action now. That this was the tail wagging the dog, that this would. That they kind of lost control over this escalation. And I actually, right before we logged on now, I saw a piece of news, which was, the two comedians in Russia, Vovan and Lexus, they usually like to call around. Apparently, they just called the Polish President Duda and pretended to be Macron. And apparently, President Duda, again, I haven't had this confirmed, I just see this post which went up, which he said, Emmanuel, believe me, I'm extremely careful. I don't blame the Russians. Do you think I want a war with Russia? No, I don't want that. So this was how in Poland responded. That this is something that apparently startled many people. So again, I know there's been a lot of speculation. Did a Ukraine make an accident, or was it a false flag? Of course, it could be both. I think I'm leaning more towards an accident, but nonetheless, it spooked a lot of the Europeans, especially because Zelensky can't continue to hammer on after they very clearly said, you have to stop doing this. There's no evidence. Don't take us down this path. So it could be a reason why he's fired. But again, this would be why he was fired. Could be just poor journalism as well.
Yeah, I read that one of the reasons they fired the one reporter, it was two reporters that ran with the stories. I heard one of the reasons, according to Mediaite, was that the AP claims that when they do stories sourced by anonymous officials, they require at a minimum 2 anonymous officials in order to publish that story. And in this instance, this AP story, which was put live, only sourced 1 U.S. anonymous intel official. So they're kind of using that as an excuse as to why this story was fake, because I
don't believe that.
But if you go by that logic, I agree. If you go by that logic, a whole bunch of questions come up to mind, absolutely. Which is, I'm sure these AP reporters knew that they need 2 anonymous sources to publish a story, and then where were the editors in all of this? I'm sure the editor, before publishing, would have said, wait a minute, I can't put this out there. I can't put this live because you're only citing 1 U.S. intel official who wants anonymity. So if anything, this firing of this AP journalist, to me, lends credence to the false flag narrative. And I've been saying for a while that I believe this was an accident, but this firing seems like they're trying to scapegoat someone. I don't know. That's just my hunch.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, maybe, but certainly, I agree with your point. And I mean, absolutely. If this was breaching the rules, then it's not just the journalist; it's the editor as well that you should go for, logically, because the editor would have approved the article. And anyway. As I said, I don't believe that explanation. But as I said, the point is, we don't know the whole story, but it does suggest that this has been taken very, very seriously at multiple levels. And I wonder whether we're going to find out who the senior intelligence official who gave the story to AP actually was.
Well, I was going to say, I think if this was a real standard, we wouldn't have had Russia Gate because Russia, whenever Trump being a secret Russian spy, or the Biden laptop being a Russian information operation, or Russia putting bounties on Americans in Afghanistan, all of this were anonymous officials, saying this and this. So that all proved to be fake. So I think this will be a very new standard to have.
Yeah. From you got time for a couple more, Glenn?
Yeah.
More questions? Okay. From Sanjeva, the problem with modern Western leaders is that they feel that the highest office, prime minister, are mid-career positions. 50 years ago, high office was the pinnacle and hence worked for a country, not for career advancement.
I think there's a lot of truth to this, actually. I don't know what Glenn's views are, but I mean, there are now all this huge cluster of institutions. And also, if you're talking about, I mean, I follow British politicians particularly, but you can see how some British politicians, once they've reached high office, Boris Johnson is already, by the way, shaping up to do this, they find that, or they try to cash in on what they've done as prime minister, by going on the lecture circuit, get paid huge sums of money. Tony Blair's become a very, very, very rich man, for example, on the strength of this. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think that's essentially right, actually. And I think this is a bad thing.
Yes, Samuel Huntington, he actually wrote about this in 2004. He was making the point that this was this fell under what he called globalist, which has become very popularized now, of course. But the main argument was that with all this new global institutions, you have the political elite, political leadership, who often displayed more and more loyalty towards. And one of the reasons was when they're in office for national governments, they would use their positions in a manner which would ensure that once they moved out of there, then they could take new jobs. I mean, we have often you're rewarded as well. I think the current Secretary General of NATO is he's Norway's previous prime minister. We were one of the heaviest bombers of Libya. I think 10% of all bombs dropped on Libya were ours. And I don't have any secret documents here, but I'm guessing that if he hadn't been so eager in destroying or bombing that country, perhaps he wouldn't have been rewarded with this position. And again, it's not just NATO; it's a lot of international institutions in which if you use your role as a government for national parliament or national governments in a favorable way, then you have a retirement plan thereafter or new jobs. So again, it wouldn't surprise me to see more of this, especially in the EU bureaucracy of former government officials who have shown themselves loyal to have safe jobs thereafter. But again, this was Huntington's argument in 2004, and I think it's panned out. It's a lot of evidence which has been piling up since.
Right. From Euro Gabor, not all EU companies are leaving the continent. Many relocate to Hungary, where political stability, cheap labor, and energy is available for them to run, and they are closer to home as well. This I did not know that companies are relocating to Hungary.
I have heard this. I don't know the scale of it that is happening, but it doesn't surprise me.
From Kay Denza, have you guys heard about Westinghouse coming to Poland to help build their first nuclear power plant? They're trying to build fleets of plants in Europe, but as far as I know, no more are scheduled to be built in the United States.
Yes, I mean, I've heard this, but I mean, Westinghouse is expensive, and building these things takes an awfully long time. And I'm not convinced, by the way, that the rupture with Russia is behind all of this, because I cannot imagine a nuclear power station being built in Poland by Russia at any conceivable twist of the political situation, if I can put it like that.
It is a shame, though, because Russia is a very interesting actor. We often focus on Russia in in the oil and gas, but actually the nuclear energy industry, Russia's kind of huge. And one of the reasons is it has, like a turnkey solution. It can do pretty much everything. It builds the nuclear power plants. It can provide the fuel. It can even operate them. The dispense of the used nuclear fuel. So they have a lot of nuclear power plants on their books. So they would have been a good contractor, but given the very toxic relationship between Poland and Russia, I would agree that I think they would rather fire up coal than go to the Russians. So yeah.
From Ronald B, is the anti-inflation package going to facilitate industry in the U.S. or just encourage huge industries likely to partner with the government in classic fascism?
Well, I'm going to it is going to create a greater degree of interdependence between government and industry. And we've seen, especially with military industries, how unhealthy that can be. I have to say, it's not unique. I mean, it's any country that has a big industrial system, industry and government talk to each other. Industry looks to government for support. If you know anything at all about Germany, for example, which of course, I mean, I do know. I know people in Germany. I mean, there's always been a very, very close bond between German business and German politics, and historically, it has been, I think, a good thing for Germany. The thing I would say is that relationship in Germany seems to be breaking down. I mean, ideology and politics seem to be predominating. And that's why in the United States, where they've come up with this particular act, businesses seem to be migrating there.
From @Geg, in a recent Wealthian interview, Alistair MacLeod made the point that in isolating Russian banks early in the conflict, the West unwittingly insulated Russian banks from the damage of Western sanctions. Any truth to that?
The Russian deputy prime minister in charge of the overall charge of the economy, a man called Belousov, has actually now just come out and said this. He didn't specifically talk about banks, but he said that the paradoxical effect of the sanctions was because they were so quickly imposed and so all-embracing, is that once it became possible, once Russia stabilized its economic position, the result is it's now actually easier in some ways to plan forward, because you don't have to worry all the time about what people in Brussels or Frankfurt or London or New York might do. And he even came up with this extraordinary thing. He said, it's extraordinary fact that we're now becoming, in economic terms, a kind of island of stability, because we can plan, we can look forward, we're bringing down our inflation numbers, we can look to what we should be doing in the future, we can plan our investment targets, we can do all those sort of things. Whereas in Europe, where the situation is far less stable, there's much more inflation there. Inflation is rising. Inflation numbers are rising. They don't know for certain where their energy is going to come from. Their ability to plan ahead and to engage in long-term investment, that's not possible anymore, as it is with us. Now, it was a most extraordinary speech, I have to say, by Russian Deputy Prime Minister. Perhaps he was gilding the lily, as we say in Britain, I mean, making things look a little better than they were. And he said this at an economic forum in the Far East just a few days ago. I think there's some truth to it, all the same.
All right, let's do a couple of more from Petras Bagdonas. There are no spectators to all that is going on. As the character Detective Tom Craven stated to the film Edge of Tomorrow, you are either hanging on the cross or banging the nails. Well said. And from Sammy Luati, I personally put an end date to the dollar EU June 2024. Wow. Do you think it could survive more than 2 winters, Glenn Alexander? Can it survive more than 2 winters?
Glenn?
Well, I'm always a bit careful with setting specific dates. That's very specific, though, by the way.
Yeah.
But no, I do think it's gonna that is gonna unravel. And but again, there's much that you could do before that time, and both good or right, good things or wrong things. So it's I don't know. I would be hesitant to set a date, but I do think that the euro has overextended itself, and also with these sanctions, like I mentioned before, the EU has made itself very, very unpredictable. And again, that's a bit reference to the previous questions as well, because in the West in Europe, the entire economic system has been very. If you look at supply chains, everything has been like last minute, so you don't have need for this everything from warehouses, but also with financial system, it's been very flexible, but which also makes it more difficult to absorb pain. In contrast, the Russian financial system has been much more conservative, and they've been avoiding too great exposures in the. And this was kind of the key argument, I think it was back in 2017, I think Wall Street Journal of Forbes, that a title was "The Russian economy is now bulletproof from sanctions." And, essentially, so because they were preparing for this for a long time, because they saw that, relations weren't improving. So, but the EU, I think, is going to be, it's not just an adjustment. I think without the trust, without the resources, natural resources, without the huge markets, things will begin to complicate. And again, if it was just a state, it would be one thing. But because it's a international institution of 27 members, once the economy begins to fragment, the political fragmentation will further undermine the economy. So I would be very surprised if the EU exists in its current form in the next 3 to 5 years. But nailing down the specific month, for that would require a crystal ball, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Glenn, is Norwegian opinion of the U.S. negative or positive?
I think overall, I think it's positive. I think there was more criticism in the past, but in relation to the war in Ukraine, I think many people reached the conclusion after February that, effectively what NATO's been saying, that, the Americans is right all along. Look at this instability. America's kind of the only, anchor of stability for us. So we have to, move closer to the United States. So we signed an agreement last year also with opening 4 military bases of the United States on our soil, which breaches the no base policy we had since World War II. So I think all of this signals that it's very pro-American, at least, I think the majority, but it's hard to say because you're not. Criticism these days does not go down well. If you criticize the US, then you criticize NATO, then suddenly you're anti-Ukrainian and you're a Putin puppet. So I don't feel people speak very freely anymore.
Absolutely. Can I just quickly add to that? I mean, last night, as it happens, my wife made me sit through a rather sentimental Christmas film, which came out in 1990, in the mid 2000s, and it had a prime minister British prime minister was being played by Hugh Grant, and of course he gets a round of applause when he stands up to the United States. Wow. And it's a sort of moment. Well, it is inconceivable that we could have a film like that made today. I mean, that's again, the change that there's been over the last few years between the sort of feeling that, the Americans were pushing us around too much, which was very common in Britain, when that film was made, and the situation today when we're basically tied to them and we can't really criticize them in any form.
Well, one of the more famous Norwegian academics, he's very old now, Johan Galtung, he's like the Chomsky of Norway. He's got 100 books, all of this. Anyways, he has a statement where he argues that, he loves the U.S. Republic, but he hates the U.S. empire. And I think that kind of summarizes it for most people. They most people like the United States, but they don't care much for its its quest for world dominance, if you will, which is its official foreign policy, stability through hegemony. So.
Ricardo Alfonso says this missile strike was an ad hoc false flag. The Ukrainians left the U.S. out of the loop and tried to lead them by the nose into war. Wag the dog.
Yeah,
comment. Good comment. Sparky says U.S. exploited its righteous reputation, the good guys, to dupe European leaders. Too bad the reputation's squandered, as it took a long time to build. Interesting comment there as well from Sparky. From summer of 1970, will Iran or Persia really work with the House of Saud if it joins BRICS?
Well, we'll find out.
This is I think it's important not to look at the same as BRICS or the SCO, this kind of organization, as an alliance, because as Russia and China often point out, they're not in alliance because they don't want to be part of the bloc politics. They see this as a kind of a cancer. And so, even in the SCO, a lot of the countries who are members there, it's security with other members, not security against non-members. And that's an important distinction to make. So Pakistan and India, for example, they're both in SCO, India and China. So the main objective is then to solve the differences between members in order to strengthen all parties involved. I mean, this wasn't alien to the Europeans either. When we began the coal and steel cooperation, the predecessor of the European Union, the main idea was the Europeans wanted to prevent war with other members. So, the French and Germans shouldn't go to war anymore. After the Cold War, this changed. Instead of having security with other members, we began to embrace security against non-members. This was a lot of European leaders pointing out we no longer fear war against each other, but, effectively the garden analogy. Now we have to go out and weed the garden. So now you seek security against those who are not part of your club. And my simple point is that neither BRICS or SCO or any of these Eurasian institutions, they have that alliance format. So the idea of Iran and Saudi Arabia allying against the rest of the world, I think that's never going to happen, not in our lifetime. But I do think that BRICS is an important institution in order to set up alternative economic connections between, for example, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and try to find a way for those two countries to work together in the region to have more peace. So again, strengthening both sides by having security with each other. But again, I don't see an alliance. But again, BRICS was never intended to be an alliance anyway. So,
all right. And from @Geg, in the U.S., monetary policy elevates the central power over states. With the EU, member states became financially akin to U.S. states, which have seen similar distortions between local economies. I make the point that the EU is a way to accumulate central power through financial coercion. Not going so well, perhaps, but centralization is the goal, not freedom.
Very interesting and astute statements.
Well said, yeah. And let's do one more here, and we'll wrap it up. Let's see. Ricardo Alfonso says the U.S. is about to adopt two problem children, Ukraine and the EU. It'll be an economic black hole for them.
Well, I think Ukraine is already turning very much into that. But always I say this, remember also that the people who are suffering most as a result of what goes on in Ukraine, saving Ukraine is destroying Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are going through a nightmare. I've just been seeing some more pictures from Kiev, and I mean, they're just awful to see what is going on there. But yes, I agree. This is a bottomless well. We're going to go on pouring money and weapons and all things like that down it. And it will also be a major drain on Europe, and it's going to get worse.
Yeah. And Raphael says, one thing Russia is 100% sure USA doesn't want and can't fight them. This is why Putin calls her in his speech intimidator, noisemaker. Well said from Raphael. All right. Let's see here. Any final comments, final thoughts, Glenn, Alexander, and we'll wrap it up.
Glenn, I think I'd be very
maybe just add quickly on what Alexander just mentioned with this, the horrors of what's happening in Ukraine, because I think it's important. to remember that not just the war, the economic collapse, but also the lights going out, and it's a truly humanitarian crisis, and for that reason, I think it's I don't care for this idea that many people have tried to monopolize on what it means to be pro-Ukrainian, because they suggest this means simply to go against Russia on everything and push Ukraine in the middle, and from my perspective, they painted a huge target on the back of Ukraine. So just remember that back in 2008, this was when William Burns, the ambassador to Moscow, and then now the director of the CIA, he wrote in 2008 that this would happen. If U.S. tried to drag Ukraine into NATO, at that time there was only about 20-25% who wanted to join. He predicted that there would be an eternal civil war in Ukraine, since it's a divided country, and that probably Russia would intervene militarily. And he added that Russia would not want to do this, but that's something they would do because they see NATO as a threat. And so my question is that the people who position themselves as being pro-Ukrainian, why did they offer future membership to Ukraine in 2008 when there was a small minority who wanted it? What was toppling the government in 2014? Was that really in Ukraine's interest? It did not have a democratic majority support of Ukrainians. Supporting the anti-terrorist operation against Eastern Ukrainians, was that pro-Ukrainian? Or sabotaging the Minsk peace agreement from 2015, which could have integrated Donbass as a part of Ukraine, although with autonomy? Or when the Ukrainians finally, with 73%, voted for Zelensky in 2019 on a peace mandate. He would talk to Donbass, he would talk to Russia, he would implement the Minsk agreement. This was a peace mandate he was elected on. And yet, this peace mandate was sabotaged, largely because of pressures from the United States as well as the nationalists. How was this pro-Ukrainian? And of course, lastly, intervening when Russia finally invaded, and the Ukrainians and the Russians seemed to be reaching a peace. This was in March, early April. Then Fiona Hill, I'm not sure if you read the piece she wrote in Foreign Affairs in October of this year. She wrote that there were she's a big Russia hawk, by the way, so not a friend of Russia. And she was making the point that Russia and Ukraine was very close to a deal. Russia pretty much wanted a guarantee that Ukraine would not join NATO. And then it would be willing to withdraw troops to where it was on the 24th. And again, this was also then undermined by the British and the Americans. So and all of this is sold always as being pro-Ukrainian. And I'm just wondering, I've been arguing since 2008 that we're simply painting a huge target sign on the backs of the Ukrainians who are now suffering immensely. Of course, not just because of NATO, but also Russia's military intervention or invasion. But still, how is any of this pro-Ukrainian? No one ever informed me of this. And anyone who has criticized it, they're on the side of the Russians against the Ukrainians. It's just a cheap propaganda ploy. So I just wanted to add that to what you said.
I think it's a very powerful point, actually, Glenn, and I think it needs saying. And you said it beautifully and very well.
Yeah. On that note, we will end this live stream. Thank you to Alexander Mercouris in London. Thank you to Glenn Diesen in Norway. And Glenn, I have all your information in the description box down below. And I will also place information as to where you can follow Glenn and pick up his many books as well. I will have that as a pinned comment after this stream ends. And thank you to our moderators, Valias, Spartan Warrior Queen, Zarael, Reckless Abandon, and myself. That's it. Thank you very much to our moderators. And let me see, is there anything else that we have to cover, Alexander? I think that is everything.
That's it. That's everything.
Thank you to everyone that watched us on Rockfin, on Odyssey, on Rumble, on YouTube, and the Duran.locals.com, our great locals community. Thank you, Glenn, very, very much. It has been an absolute pleasure to have you on, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, everybody, take care.